I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, even as I appear to you to cover this installment of our coverage of research methodology, where we are examining certain critical aspects of literature review, which is a key process in undertaking research, either as students or as academics, or just as researchers, even in industry settings. In my previous video, where I explained the purpose and the 6 different types of literature review, I promised that in a subsequent video, which is this video, I'm going to cover the 14 different types of literature review. The way and manner in which I will cover these 14 different types of literature review, it will follow the approach that has been suggested by M.J. Grant and A. Booth, 2009, in their work, which is entitled A Typology of Reviews and Analysis of 14 Reviews, Review Types, and Associated Methodologies, which work was published in the Health Information and Libraries Journal. And the article appears in volume 26, between pages 91 and 108 inclusive. So I had to acknowledge the primary source of what I'm presenting today, which is a critical part of literature review. When we get information from someone or some people, we have to acknowledge sources. Not to acknowledge sources is plagiarism. And since I'm teaching you research methodology, it's very imperative that I also demonstrate integrity in the work that I'm doing by acknowledging my sources. So straight away, I'm going to cover briefly the 14 different types of literature review. We'll start with the critical review. This type of literature review, its main objective is to demonstrate clearly that the writer has extensively researched the literature, surveyed the literature, and critically analyzed and evaluated different kinds of literature in terms of their quality. So the critical review goes mere description or just mere analysis to include such an advanced form of analysis and conceptual innovation. So when someone is undertaking a critical review, the end game is to produce a hypothesis or to produce a model. That's the end game, to produce an hypothesis or a model. So that's the first type of literature review. The first type of literature review seeks to demonstrate that the researcher has extensively surveyed literature and critically evaluated its quality. It means the student will be knowing all the corners of the literature, the extant literature on a particular research problem or research area. So the aim of this type of literature review is to identify the most significant or critical elements in a particular broad research area or field. The field might be, say, structured finance. So the student might be interested in investigating a specific problem in structured finance. So using the funnel approach, the student progresses from the general to the particular by identifying, the key literature, the key authorities in a particular area. So this type of literature review is significant in that it shows us the critical items or the critical elements in a particular field. In terms of appraisal, the reviewer may or may not come up with a formal statement on quality, because usually literature review does not just end with a critical review. There are other types of literature review or other strategies or approaches to literature review that are actually adopted by researchers. There is no researcher in any field who just relies on one method to produce a document. So when it comes to synthesis, this type of literature review can be typically narrative, but it will be narrative not in a descriptive sense, but in a conceptual or chronological sense. There is a high level of analysis and conceptual innovation in this analysis or synthesis that I'm talking about. So the narrative aspect is from a conceptual or a chronological aspect or perspective. So analysis is a significant component of a critical review, as it is imperative under this type of literature review to identify the conceptual contribution of the extant literature that the reviewer will be examining to our understanding of the phenomenon in terms of existing theories, so as to derive either new theories or new hypotheses. So that's the first type of literature review. The second type of literature review that I want us to explore is what is called the mapping review or systematic map, which I alluded to in a previous lecture when I was just presenting these types of literature review in passing. The purpose of this review or analytical procedure or this approach to literature review is to map out and categorize the existing literature, the extant literature, from which to commission further reviews. So one has to sift through the literature, examine the literature, which can form the primary basis of further research or further review, what we call the secondary literature review. Not the literature review of secondary sources, but the secondary literature review as in literature review of sources that follow a logical progression when we look at those which are considered to be primary. So there is primary research, and in that primary research, we identify knowledge gaps that exist in the extant literature, which makes up the primary research. And after identifying knowledge gaps, we try to check whether these knowledge gaps, they are not catered for in the secondary literature that explores certain concepts in detail. This secondary literature may not actually be holistic in the sense of covering, the entire, broad spectrum, as it were, of concepts in a particular field. The secondary literature might be just examining a specific element in the extant literature, but going deeper to cover whatever has been identified as gaps in the primary literature. What's the main aim, or what's the thrust of this kind of literature review? Is to come up with completeness and also to determine the time and the scope constraints. Is to have a complete picture of what the extant literature is, a complete picture of what the extant literature is either saying or the theories that prevail in the extant literature. The modus operandi of coming up with this kind of literature review is to come up with a table or a graph where the different kinds of literature are juxtaposed with one another, and then gaps can be easily identified. So when you look at this kind of literature review, it characterizes quantity and quality of literature by examining the research design and other key features of the literature. And it tends to classify literature into primary or secondary literature. The third type of literature review, it is mixed studies review or mixed methods review. Mixed studies review or mixed methods review. This involves or refers to a combination of methods where one significant component is a literature review, usually systematic literature review. So within a review context, it refers to a combination of review approaches. So there will be a combination of review approaches. Some may be qualitative, others quantitative, in order to give us a complete picture or a blend of qualitative and quantitative strategies of our understanding of what the extant literature is actually saying on a particular research problem. So this kind of literature review proceeds by analyzing with the purpose of characterizing both literatures, that is qualitative and quantitative literatures, and examining correlations between characteristics and or use gap analysis to identify aspects which may be absent in one form of literature but present in another form of literature. And then before I go any further, the fourth type of literature review is actually literature review itself. It's actually called literature review. Literature review is a generic term, but it also refers to a specific strategy in literature review where published materials that provide an examination of recent or current literature are examined. In terms of scope, when we are looking at the literature review approach to literature review, I know it sounds a bit funny to say of the literature review approach to literature review. The scope compared to other strategies or procedures to literature review, it tends to be very wide. Different kinds of issues may be covered, including research findings. A key feature of this kind of literature review, this type of literature review called literature review, is that it normally includes research findings. And it's quite explicit also on the methodologies that we use. The aim is to be complete and to be comprehensive at the same time. So the aim is twofold, to have completeness and comprehensiveness. That's the aim, that's the design of this scheme of literature review. And the fifth type of literature review is what is called meta-analysis, which has become very topical with the first book, for instance, changing into meta. You know, meta-analysis. This is a technique or a method that statistically combines the results of quantitative studies to provide a more precise and concise effect of those results. So the method may proceed by way of graphical and tabular approaches, which are normally accompanied by a short or a long narration of the results. The main aim is to be exhaustive and comprehensive in actually examining the extant literature. The procedure may use the funnel plot or the funnel approach in order to assess completeness. There may be quality assessment to determine inclusion or exclusion, or sensitivity or sensitivity analysis. So there's quite a lot of resorting to statistics in order to provide measures of effect, assuming absence of heterogeneity, which means there will be homogeneity, so to speak. The sixth type of literature review is what is known as the overview. The overview is also a generic term, just like literature review is a generic term. This involves the summary of the literature that attempts to survey the literature and describe its characteristics. The overview type of literature review is especially important when it comes to those studies that are anchored on theories that have existed for quite a long time, where it may be important to engage in chronological, conceptual, or thematic mapping of issues. So the analysis from what I've just said may be chronological, conceptual, or thematic, where we are looking at a certain issue. So the scheme may involve a comprehensive search of the literature, but it doesn't necessarily need to be comprehensive. This depends on whether the overview is systematic or not. If the overview is systematic, then it may end up being comprehensive as well. We move on to the seventh type of literature review, which is the qualitative systematic review, which is also called the qualitative evidence synthesis. The qualitative systematic review, which is also called the qualitative evidence synthesis. This method involves integrating or comparing the findings from qualitative studies. As the name indicates, this scheme normally works when someone is either researching on a phenomenon which is qualitative in nature, or is undertaking research in an area where the variables are qualitative in orientation. So the aim of this scheme or approach to literature review is to come up with themes or constructs that underpin a particular research area or that underpin certain qualitative studies. So there may be quite a lot of judgmental sampling, which is also called purposive or selective sampling, involved. There may be quality assessment, which is resorted to in order to mediate messages, but not for inclusion or exclusion purposes. This scheme or approach may be qualitative or narrative, but it tends to be heavily thematic when we are looking at the analytical procedure. And the model formulation, as well as presentation, might be actually quite pronounced in the scheme. So that's the seventh method of approaching literature review. And then where someone needs to, quickly produce a term paper or a research paper, but not a typically long one. Someone might engage in the eighth type of literature review, which is the rapid review. The aim of this one is to come up with a complete picture given time constraints. So it proceeds by way of assessing what is already known about a policy, a practice, a process, or issue. It uses the systematic review methods to search and critically appraise existing or extant literature. It tends to be constrained in terms of time and may involve formal quality assessment. It is usually narrative and may be tabular or graphical in orientation, depending on the choice of the person who is doing the literature review, what they choose to adopt in order to undertake this literature review, the mode of presentation of the literature review after they've undertaken the rapid review. Quantities of literature and overall quality, they might be clearly or indirectly explained in the rapid review, because the aim is to provide a complete picture given time constraints. And then the ninth type of literature review is the scoping review. The scoping review normally informs the study at its preliminary stages. It doesn't make sense when someone is just about to go for field work to do a scoping review, because the scoping literature review approach is normally a preliminary assessment of the potential size and scope of the available literature. So it has to be done at the beginning of the study, typically when someone is developing a research proposal, so that the student may ascertain whether the study will be progressed, whether the student will be able to progress with the study from start to finish. That assessment can only be made after the student has done the scoping literature review. So the kind of literature review that assists a student to produce a research methodology, to produce a research proposal, for instance, it's either the rapid review or the scoping review or both. The rapid review is necessary to produce evidence-based, author-based, researcher-based, extant literature-based background to the study, not speculative background to the study, which I alluded to in an earlier video where I was presenting about the structure of the research proposal. So the scoping review, just like the rapid review, is usually tabular, and maybe this tabular method of presentation may be accompanied by some narration, some narrative commentary. It may characterize quantity and quality of the literature, most probably using research design, a population of study, research instruments, or the econometric model that was adopted, as well as other features that the researcher may deem relevant in categorizing the literature in terms of quantity and quality. The 10th type of literature review is what is known as the state-of-the-art review. This state-of-the-art review, its tendency is to address or to deal with more current matters, in contrast to other combined retrospective or current approaches. But it may offer new views, viewpoints, or perspectives. The aim is to be comprehensive in searching for the current literature. Since the aim is to search for current literature, it may not be particularly important to assess the quality of the current literature. So the current state of knowledge and priorities for future investigation are normally assessed, as part of the analysis, but as part of the synthesis involved in the state-of-the-art review, it tends to be typically narrative and may have tabular accompaniments with detailed or brief commentary. And then we have got the 11th type of literature review, perhaps one of the most critical types of literature review, the systematic review. With the systematic review, the researcher searches for, appraises, and synthesizes research evidence, normally sticking to guidelines on how to conduct the review of the literature. So there are specific guidelines that are followed by the researcher in reviewing the literature. These guidelines, they may be according to the discipline in which the student is conducting the research, or they may be according to the theories that have prevailed and that have been generally accepted in a particular area. The aim of this type of literature review is to be exhaustive and comprehensive. So it's to be as exhaustive and as comprehensive as possible. There's usually quality assessment to determine exclusion or inclusion of literature. So the aim is to determine whether particular literature is really relevant to a particular research area or research problem, or irrelevant. If it is irrelevant, then through systematic review, the literature just falls by the wayside. It means when we are now moving to research methodology, we may not anchor the model formulation and our own analysis of the variables of start, or our own tackling of the research problem using literature which we deem has to be excluded. So what is known, as well as recommendations for practice, and what remains unknown, uncertainties around findings, as well as recommendations for future research or for future investigations, are normally made under the systematic review because it tends to be exhaustive and comprehensive. The 12th type of literature review is called the systematic search and review. It's called the systematic search and review. It combines strengths of critical review with a comprehensive search process. It typically addresses broad questions to produce best evidence synthesis. So it aims for exhaustive, comprehensive searching of the literature. It may include quality assessment or it may exclude it. So under this scheme, it may not be necessary to assess the quality of the literature, but some authors or some researchers who have adopted this type of literature review in the past, they have felt the need to do quality assessment of the literature. It tends to be minimally narrative. May use the tabular approach or tabular summaries of studies to avoid very lengthy narrations or very lengthy critical reviews, to move on to research methodology and other critical aspects of a research document or a research project. So what is known in terms of recommendations for practice as well as limitations pertaining to the study or pertaining to the research problem or research area that the researcher has chosen are clearly mapped out under the systematic search and review. And then the 13th type of literature review, not to be confused with the systematic review, is what is known as the systematized review. This type of literature review, it attempts to include elements of systematic review of the systematic review process while stopping short of a systematic review. It's typically conducted as postgraduate student assignments and may be used by students who are undertaking postgraduate degrees, especially where they are doing a degree with a research component. And most master's degrees nowadays have a research component. So what is known, uncertainties around findings, limitations of research methodology may be clearly spelled out. The systematized review, which just falls short of systematic review, may be typically narrative with tabular accompaniments, which may be briefly followed or accompanied by, concise and precise commentaries. And then the last type of literature review is what is known as the umbrella. the umbrella review or the umbrella type of literature review. This specifically refers to reviewing evidence from multiple sources into one accessible or usable document. It focuses on a broad condition or research problem for which there are so many competing interventions or theories, and highlights reviews that address these interventions and their results. The aim is to identify component reviews, but not search for primary studies. So the person who is undertaking an umbrella review, their main aim might not be to search for primary studies, but quality assessments are normally common under this type of literature review within component reviews and or of reviews themselves. So the researcher might actually assess the quality of the study on the basis of its limitations, on the basis of its assumptions, on the basis of the main findings, and on the basis of the case studies that were used and the approaches that were used, bearing in mind the assumptions and the limitations of those studies. The umbrella review might be accompanied by graphical and tabular presentations with narrative commentary. What is known in terms of recommendations for practice and what remains unknown in terms of suggestions for further study are clearly mapped out under the umbrella review. So I believe that these 14 different types of literature review that I've just briefly covered in this video will assist you in understanding how you ought to conduct your research work as part of your graduate studies, as part of your final year bachelor's degree studies. So I believe that you have benefited from this study. Have a good day.